Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our latest episode about courage titled The Courage of an Athlete. If this is your first time tuning in, I want to thank you for being here. I also want to let you know this is a safe place. Keep checking us out. My name is Daniel Ochoa, and this channel is devoted to teach people how to live a life that truly honors God. Now, if you're ready, let's get started. Dear Diary, Sunday, it's my birthday and I'm now in that 40s category, and my wife's gift to me is a week with a personal trainer at a health club. Even though I'm still in okay shape when I was on the varsity chess team in high school, I decided that it was a good idea to go ahead and try to improve. So I called and made reservations with someone named Tanya, who identified herself as a 25-year-old aerobics instructor and a model for athletic clothing and swimwear. My wife seemed very pleased to see how enthusiastic I was to get started. Monday. Oh, I'm so excited about getting in better shape. I got up at 6 a.m. It was hard, but it was worth it. When I arrived at the health club, Tanya was already there waiting for me. She's gorgeous, dazzling white smile, blonde hair, and amazing eyes. She showed me the machines, and after 5 minutes on the treadmill, she took my pulse. She seemed a little alarmed that it was high, but I think her standing there in that outfit added about 10 points. Tanya was very encouraging as I did my sit ups, though my gut was already aching a little from holding it in the whole time I was talking to her. This is going to be great. Tuesday. Took me a whole pot of coffee to get me out the door, but I made it. Tanya made me lie on my back and push up this iron bar into the air, and then she put weights on it, for heaven's sakes. My legs seemed a little wobbly on the treadmill, but I made it the full half mile. She also had me sit on a machine that builds my biceps. This has to be good because I always wanted big biceps. Her smile made it all worth it. All my muscles feel great. This is going to be a new me this year. Wednesday. The only way I can brush my teeth is by laying the toothbrush on the counter and moving my mouth back and forth over it. I'm pretty sure I developed a hernia in both pectorals. Driving was okay as long as I didn't have to turn. Tanya was impatient with me and said that my screaming was bothering the other health members. The treadmill hurt my chest, so Tanya made me do the stair monster. Why would anyone want to invent a machine to simulate an activity that was obsolete by elevators? Tanya told me that regular exercise would be good and I would live longer. I'm starting to wonder why I would want to. Thursday, Tanya was waiting for me with vampire teeth and a full snarl. I can't help it if I was a half hour late. It took me that long just to tie my shoes. She wanted me to lift dumbbells. Not a chance, Tanya. The word dumb must be in there for a reason. I told her that I was going to get a drink, but I hid in the men's room. She sent Big Mike in there to get me. As punishment, she made me try the rowing machine. I sank it. Friday, I hate Tanya more than any human being has ever hated another human being in the history of the world. If there was any part of my body that was not in extreme pain, I would hit her with it. She thought that it would be a good idea for me to work on my triceps. Well, I got news for you, Tanya. I don't have any triceps. And if you don't want dents in your floor, then don't hand me anything that weighs more than a sandwich. I refuse to accept any responsibility for any damage because you're the one that went to health school, so you're the one to blame. Saturday, Tanya left a voice message on my answer machine wondering where I was. Just hearing that skinny, anemic little cheerleader's voice made me want to smash the machine. I lacked the strength to use the TV remote, so I watched 7 hours of the Weather Channel. Sunday, thank God this week is over. I decided to just get used to the shape that I'm already in because I guess there are some things you just can't change about yourself. Have you ever felt like that in your walk with Christ where you want to change and become more like Christ, but it's just too hard at times? I know I have. Now, throughout our lives as we journey in our walk with Jesus, we come across every once in a while mature believers, men and women who truly reflect Christ. And we say to ourselves, I hope someday I can be like that. Or we see the courage of men and women in the Bible like Paul, Nehemiah, Moses, and we say to ourselves, I want to have that type of courage. Now, last week I mentioned how we can all picture how we would like our lives to turn out 10 years from now. But when we look at our everyday life, it doesn't reflect the type of person that we want to become, the type of follower of Christ we want to become. And sometimes the frustration of walking with God becomes so overwhelming that we say to ourselves, it's just too hard. I guess you just can't change who I am. Well, thankfully, a couple thousand years ago, Paul wrote a letter to his dear friend Timothy. And in this letter, Paul gave him three metaphors on what courage looks like. So let's take a look at that letter. 2 Timothy 2. Join with me in suffering like a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No one serving as a soldier gets entangled in civilian affairs, but rather tries to please his commanding officer. Similarly, anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules. The hard-working farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. Reflect on what I am saying, for the Lord will give you insight into all of this. Now, that is exactly what we've been doing. We've been reflecting on Paul's words to Timothy so that the Lord gives us insight on how to live a life of courage. A couple of episodes ago, we talked about the soldier, and we discovered that they find their courage to stand firm on the battlefield comes from an understanding that they have been called to a cause that is greater than themselves. In our last episode, we discovered that an athlete displays their courage in his or her training, how they train every day, whether they feel like it or not. Today, we're going to look at the athlete again, and we're going to dive deeper into what it means to compete according to the rules. After all, God is the one that created all things. It is His rule. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to look at 4 keys that we must apply in our lives if we're going to have the courage to live according to the rules. Key number 1, if I'm going to live with the courage of an athlete, then I must learn to live with ridicule. When you go to a sporting event, who do the fans ridicule? The visiting team. We need to understand that as followers of Christ, we are the visiting team. That's why Paul said in Philippians 3:20, but our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await our Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ. Also, it says this in 1 Peter 2:11 and 12. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. In this verse, he is telling us not to sin, meaning he is telling us to live a life where we compete according to the rules of God. Why? So that others will be drawn to our good deeds and they may have an open mind to Christianity. Have you ever noticed how loyal people are to their teams? It doesn't matter if their team has just drafted a player that everybody knows is a dirty player. Once that player is on their team, they start justifying why they like that player. If I'm going to have the courage of an athlete, the courage that God calls me to have, then I must hold my allegiance to God and His rules, not the world. As followers of Christ, would you say that ridicule is inevitable? Of course. That's why Jesus said in John 15:20, remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obey my teaching, they will obey yours also. What this verse is saying is, if you're a Christian, then you will be persecuted. Now, living in America, there's very little persecution going on. However, I do believe that stages are being set in this country that's going to change the way Christians will be treated in the near future. So, knowing that ridicule is inevitable, how does this help me on my Monday morning? Well, I shouldn't be surprised when it happens. I'll never forget this time when I was in the military. I went in at 18 to become a military police officer. And in our very first week, they told us that in our last few weeks of training, which is 3 months from then, that we will do simulations where we go out, arrest people, put them in the back seat, take them to the station, fill out all the paperwork to make sure we do everything properly. Now, they did tell us that when we arrest these people, they may say things that we don't like, but it's a test to see how we handle it. So 3 months later, me and my partner, we get a call. We go arrest this gentleman. We put him in the back seat of the car, and he starts with the ridicule. Now, I remembered what I was told in the very first week, and I just kind of laughed and blew it off. But he struck a nerve with my partner, and the guy in the back seat knew that, so he kept at it even harder. And then he said something about his mother, and my partner lost it. Well, when we got back to the station, it was all recorded and he was kicked out of the academy. The reason I share that story with you is to remind you that ridicule is inevitable. It's going to happen. And how we handle that ridicule will determine whether or not we have the courage of an athlete. Have you ever noticed how you can always see the difference between a young athlete and a mature athlete when it comes to ridicule? The young athlete allows the ridicule to get to them. It can even affect their performance in the game. While the mature athlete is disciplined, it doesn't phase him. It's almost like he doesn't even hear it. I'll never forget this other story where me and my brother, we were in our late teens. We got some tickets to Tiger Stadium to watch the Tigers play. And we were sitting out in left field and we were pretty close to the field. And my brother and the whole section started ridiculing the opponent team's outfielder. And I mean, we were saying some really bad things. I'm not proud of that, but he just blew it off. It's almost like he was so focused on the game that he didn't hear it. And that's how we need to be as Christians. Which brings us to key number 2. If I'm going to learn to have the courage of an athlete, then I must have the key of spiritual discipline. This rule is very important because it is a rule that leads us to maturity. When we see a mature athlete, it's the result of their talent combined with their discipline. We need to understand that when we see a mature follower of Christ, it is a combination of their salvation combined with their spiritual discipline. So if I want to become a mature Christian, then I must learn spiritual discipline. Paul tells us in Hebrews 6:1, therefore, let us leave the elementary teaching about Christ and go on to maturity. What this verse is telling us that if we claim to be a follower of Christ, there comes a point in your walk, in your journey with Jesus, that we need to grow up. We need to become mature Christians. Why do you think the enemy uses ridicule to attack us? It's to take our focus off our mission. Well, what is our mission? Our mission is to live a life that reflects Jesus and to share the gospel. If you don't have a desire to live a life to reflect Jesus, then you don't have a desire to spend eternity with God because that's what heaven is. So, what is our first reaction when we're ridiculed? Well, for a lot of people, they want revenge. How does an athlete display discipline when he's ridiculed? An athlete doesn't seek revenge on those who are ridiculing him. No, he keeps his focus on the game. Who does revenge belong to? Well, the Bible tells us it belongs to God. Remember this, revenge always turns out to be a greater sin than the original sin that was committed against you. When I take my focus off my mission because others are ridiculing me, what am I actually doing? I'm helping the enemy accomplish their mission. So, what is God's rule in my life when I'm ridiculed? Well, let's look at Luke 6:27 and 36. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Now, some of you may be saying, oh, that's a hard rule. And of course it's hard. I'll agree with that. But it was also hard for Jesus to die on the cross, even while we were sinning, but he did it anyway. There's a powerful scene in the movie A League of Their Own. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that movie, but it's one of my favorite. It's based on a true story. It's about a women's baseball team that happened back in the wartime during World War II because all the men were off fighting in the war. Well, anyway, there's a woman in the movie called Dottie, and she is played by Gina Davis, and she's one of the star players. And her and all the other women are in a hotel getting ready to spend the night because the next morning they got to get up, get in the bus, and head off to the World Series. Well, that night, Dottie's husband shows up. He got wounded and he shows up at the hotel. Well, the next morning, Tom Hanks is the manager of the team. He is helping all the women get onto the bus and he notices off at a distance that Dottie's got all her stuff and she's packing it in her husband's car. So he walks over to her and he asks her, what are you doing? And after a little back and forth, she said, or Tom Hanks says, look, if you want to go home and make babies, I'm in no position to tell you what to do. But just to quit and walk away, that's not like you, Dottie. And then he said, baseball is inside you. And then she looks at him and says, it just got too hard. And then he walks right up to her face and he said, it is supposed to be hard. If it wasn't hard, everyone would be doing it. It's the hard that makes it great. We need to understand that sometimes being a Christian, it is hard. That's why this rule is so important in our lives. so we don't give up. We keep moving forward on the mission that God called us to be on. How did Jesus handle ridicule? Well, let's look at 1 Peter 2:23. It says this, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. If I'm going to learn to live a life of courage, of spiritual discipline, then I must be willing to put my trust in God and not myself when I'm ridiculed. Martin Luther King Jr. understood this rule better than most people. That's why he said this, hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. The way we respond to ridicule will determine whether or not we have this key, which brings us to key number 3. If I'm going to have the courage of an athlete, then I must remember God's promises. What is an athlete's motivation when it comes to competing? To receive the trophy. Every league promises that the team who's the best will receive a trophy. It is a promise that they can count on. We need to know God's promises in our life. It is the promises that gives us the hopes during our struggle. I remember a particular time when I was being ridiculed in Houston, Texas. I was a marketing rep and I'd have to go visit clients. And I remember this one time I went to go visit a client. He was a Jewish guy. And he started asking me about my faith. And we started getting into that conversation. He said, you know what's wrong with Christians? He said, you guys have to go through a middleman while we go directly to God. And I just smiled and said, okay. And then he asked me, he goes, hey, can I ask you a question? I said, sure. He goes, do you tithe? And I said, yeah, I tithe. He said, how much do you give to the church? And I said, I give 10%. And then he started laughing at me and he started saying, oh my God, they have you brainwashed. You give your money to the church? He said, it's like you're in a cult. And then he called his secretary in and he started ridiculing me in front of his secretary, hoping to get her to laugh and to get her to also agree with him. But she felt sorry for me. I could tell by the look in her eye. And then I just started smiling. And he's like, what are you smiling about? I said, you would never understand. And I'm going to tell you what I was smiling about. Because I remembered Matthew 5:11 and 12, where it says this. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. We need to remember God's promises when we are being ridiculed or persecuted. I guarantee Christians in other parts of the country that are being persecuted to the point of death, they remember these promises. That's what gives them the motivation to stand firm, to keep going, and to keep on their mission. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe.